This is the Jeff Santos Show on the Revolution Radio Network. Rebuilding America together. Now, here's Jeff.
It is hour 3 of the Jeff Santos Show, coming to you from the South Coast here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We're going to do a little bit of reverse order in our Tuesday lineup. Usually it's Melissa Tomlinson, then Mark Taylor-Canfield. But we reversed it this time, so we're going to go out to the 206 in the big WA and talk to an amazing journalist, the Renaissance man of the Jeff Santos Show. He's a musician. This music is his. The work that you see, you catch him on Twitter, Mark Taylor-Canfield. Of course, you catch him here every Tuesday on the Jeff Santos Show. He's been talked about on other talk shows. He's been on The Guardian. He's doing a yeoman work, and he really has been a voice for the people of Seattle, where a lot of corporate media has sold the people of greater Seattle down the river, as MTC is just singing about. It's great to have him with us. A little earlier than usual, but great to be with you, Mark. How are you?
Well, I've been better, Jeff. I know.
It's been a difficult time.
It's very difficult. Yeah, I was there when the car hit the two protesters on Interstate 5, and one of them is dead now. That was Summer Taylor.
It's very tragic.
Was an amazing person, very vivacious and energetic, wonderful, strong woman. Same with Diaz. So it's very sad, and it's been very depressing for folks like me and their family and friends. But the protests continue, and they are continuing in Seattle and in Portland. In Portland, almost every night they're using tear gas now on the protesters and declaring illegal assemblies. But the hard part for me, I think, was just not getting a chance to deal with the emotions, because as of Saturday, I was on like every network, and every local TV station in Seattle had me on. It was really difficult just, having to relive that over and over again. But I guess that's part of your job when you're a journalist, is to report the news to people. But there are memorials right now at Westlake Park for Summer Taylor. Diaz Love is the name of the other victim. He was in critical condition as of Sunday, but is holding on. So we are
Godspeed,
and we're hoping that recovers, and we hope that we never have this happen anywhere ever again. The violence against protesters has got to stop, and my firsthand experience with the violence of racism is a lesson that I will never forget. So that's one of the things I have to say about that. But the protests are continuing, and there have been marches to Jenny Durkan's home. And I apologize for if there's any noise in the background, but construction going on near me, so I'll try to get away from it.
I see. Okay.
But yeah, the mayor's had a big issue with the city council member, Kshama Sawant, who she says needs to be expelled from the city council for supposedly leading protests to her house. But then the organizers of the protests claim that she wasn't the leader, that she was just one of the people that was invited. But the mayor and the Democratic Socialist Kshama Sawant on the city council have a big personal political battle going on. And then there's also members of the city council and a lot of the activists and protesters who are calling for the resignation of Jenny Durkan for failing to rein in the Seattle Police Department when they were using copious amounts of tear gas and flashbang grenades and all sorts of things on the protesters. And they have continued to do that, by the way, when they swept the CHOP encampment, the Capitol Hill occupied protest. They did use pepper spray, and then later at other protests ended up using the flashbang grenades again and some of these more militarized weapons. And the city council on June 15th had actually voted unanimously to ban all those types of weapons. But I guess that ban doesn't go into effect until later this month, and I'm not sure what's going on with the court order from the judge, but there was also an injunction against using them. So I don't know. I mean, it just doesn't look like relations with the Seattle Police Department and the public are getting much better. And I think Durkan is still in a lot of political trouble right now. So
let me hold you there, Mark. We're talking to the great Mark Taylor-Canfield here on the Jeff Santos Show, and he is truly great. I don't use that word that often because he cares about the people that he's covering. That's a rarity in journalism today. And I also think, too, Mark, that, you've been able to give us a perspective that, we talk a lot about journalism when we're on the show together, and I really frankly feel disgusted with my profession when we're not getting all that information. I'm glad that those KOMO and other King TVs and others are putting you on. But, they should have been putting you on 2 weeks ago or, 10 days ago. And given the scenario getting out of hand and the division between, and maybe they're doing these stories, I'm not there, you are, of what Ms. Sawant is doing versus Ms. Durkan, the city council versus the mayor, what a police chief is doing to sort of influence Durkan and all the business leaders. And so there's so many different elements here. And, outside of you and following you on Twitter at Democracy Watch News, outside of that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of news being produced out of, it certainly not on CNN and MSNBC, occasionally in the New York Times, Boston Globe, which I watch and read every day. But other than that, there's not much. Why is that, Mark?
Well, first of all, just let me say that I am disappointed a lot of the time that personal and party and petty politics have taken over the story here when, from a local point of view, when protests against racism and police brutality is what this is all about and what the focus should always be about. But politicians and opportunists like to take advantage of it, and so do people in the press. And the difficult thing has been being in Seattle and watching the spin from the corporate media change every 24 hours. So you can't really count on their position today. Tomorrow they may have a completely different editorial position on some of their news stories. As far as the news that's not coming out of here, well, I can tell you from experience that there are a lot of journalists, and for whatever reason, people might say it's a bit picayune or small townish or isolated, but there are a lot of journalists in Seattle who don't really spend much time talking to anybody else but people in Seattle. It's a sort of media bubble that we're in. It's partly because we are so isolated from the rest of the country that we actually get more coverage on some of the things that are going on. And with the situation with CHOP, there was actually a lot of international news coverage. So everyone, Reuters, The Guardian, Agence France Presse, France 24, RT, everybody was all over it. And I was interviewed by The Guardian, and I think there's international attention about Seattle, but sometimes the MSNBCs and the CNNs and those folks, and especially Fox, of course, miss the whole point here because they probably don't spend a lot of time having full-time reporters here keeping them up to date. They have their affiliates, but a lot of those people, there are a few people like Deborah Horn with KING who's been here for, decades. So I've known her ever since I moved here. And there are other folks like Dave Ross at Cairo who have been around forever and stuff. But a lot of them are, a lot of the news business these days is pretty transitory, transitional. You never know when your next job is going to be or how long you're going to be there. The Associated Press is famous here, I think, for getting things wrong, like getting the neighborhoods wrong or something, because they just don't have people that live in the community that are working for them. And so the advantage of dealing with local journalists, like if I want to cover something that's happening in Boston, the best thing for me to do is to talk to a community journalist, somebody who lives there, somebody who's seen the city politics for decades or something. If it's in New York, you talk to Herb Boyd, somebody who's been around for a long time and knows the story, not somebody who just showed up on the scene because they were commissioned by Fox News to do a quick 30-second soundbite and they have no clue.
No, you're spot on
behind it. And that that's lacking in most corporate media in the United States, and we talk about this at Democracy Watch News quite a bit. The context of the news story and the history behind it. And it's sort of like for people to understand why the Seattle Police Department became so militarized, they would have to study what happened here during the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in 1999 and what happened after that. So, and also you'd have to study the drug war and federal funding and, for police departments and their relationship with the military and all of that. But without that context, it's really hard for people to wrap their mind around it. Now, folks in the black community are very well aware of the problems with racism and, Mothers Against Police Brutality was started here by Harriet Waldman after her son was killed by Seattle police, and that has been around for probably 20 years. So it's not like it's a new issue. And that's what some of the protesters have been saying is, this has been going on for a long time, and now the media is finally starting to acknowledge some issues that they've sort of ignored for so long, and that doesn't speak well for the corporate media or the political structure that these issues have been ignored for decades, even though there have been people
exactly.
marching,
Well, here's something for you. As you know, I'm a huge sports fan. I don't know how many of the players. I know Pete Carroll, who I interviewed 20 years ago when Al Gore was running against George W. Bush, and as a world of football folks, they're usually more conservative, but he was a Gore person back then. I always give him a lot of credit for that. And the fact is that I'm wondering, and he did a lot in South Central Los Angeles when he was at USC to help kids in the inner city and so forth. They literally would ride at night to help kids out. I'm wondering how he and the rest of the Seahawks and other athletes that are in Seattle, but more so the Seahawks, are elevating this issue, because I think that's one of the reasons why it's getting constant play in the media. I'm talking about police violence against African Americans, African American young males, and protesters of all sorts. But I think that there is something there. How big Russell Wilson or other players or Carroll, talking about this? Because this adds to the quote-unquote, what I've been talking about today, the average listener, the average voter, the average citizen who now says, well, Russell Wilson's talking about this now, and we've heard from a ton of athletes. I mean, Tom Brady has made a comment on it. I mean, there is a lot more than has ever been before, which is why I think a lot of mainstream media is now covering this issue, although not doing that great a job in Seattle, it seems like. Your thoughts on that?
LeBron James, LeBron has been definitely speaking out. I think
definitely
the athletes in Seattle tend to be in the Seahawks. Now, I can't report on that as a sports reporter, as you said, so I don't really know the inside story. I haven't talked to Coach Pete, although he did take part in the COVID relief benefit concert about a week ago with Pearl Jam and Sir Mix-a-Lot. And so, so the Seattle music scene is still happening. We should talk about that too. But I'd say that, the one thing that I remember, just as a resident, not as a reporter living here, is that the Seattle Seahawks were one of the first teams who decided to take a knee in support of Colin Kaepernick. And he was their former major rival. People have no idea the rivalry between the San Francisco 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks is very serious.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, and I even mentioned him in one of my songs about the Seahawks that I wrote a long time ago that, the Seahawks seem to like, but it actually, mentions him. And now the fact that the Seahawks decided, to take the knee, and Coach Carroll was so supportive of that, I mean, that kind of set a tone. I don't know what's been going on lately with the team. I haven't really been following sports much because I think that this.
Well, nobody, because they've all been off. But early
it's
since
also been my major.
February.
Yeah, my job has been to cover the protests, so I haven't really had my ears open too much. But I do remember that sense of solidarity, which surprised me, and that's sportsmanship too. Even a team that you are totally rivals with, but they were in solidarity with Kaepernick. So, and that issue still needs to be dealt with too, by the way. But
there's no doubt. Talking with our good friend Mark Taylor-Canfield, I want to give our great producer Ron a heads up. I'm going to call for our friends from Pearl Jam in about 30 seconds here, Ron. But before we listen to the great Eddie Vedder and company, I want to ask you this. Do you feel like you are giving the people, as a journalist, this quick answer if you might, a understanding? The work that I've seen, I think people who are just tangentially following you on Twitter must get a really interesting perspective from you. Do you feel like you're able to sort of get that message out about what is happening on the streets of Seattle?
We can only speak for our own experiences and see what we see. It's just one perspective, but it's mine, and it is real because I'm down there on the streets with the protesters, watching everything that's going on, and monitoring the press briefings, and hopefully give a voice to people who don't normally have it. I mean, that's one thing I've had a lot of discussions lately with other journalists and alternative media about Like, I've interviewed a lot of very famous people and past presidential candidates, really high-level people, billionaires. But I really prefer these days interviewing people who have never been interviewed before, or whose voices aren't really being heard. Because
I think that's so important.
Jeff Bezos has plenty of people to...
Yes, exactly. We don't need to hear more from Jeff Bezos or Gates or anybody else. All right, let's do a little better, man. Of course, the great Eddie Vedder on vocals and the great Pearl Jam doing wonderful things in Seattle and across the country. Wondering if there has been any sort of discussion from those who are reformers in the police department. Because Seattle is such a progressive city, and I'm thinking that there have to be some people in the police force there that are trying internally to try to get to these folks in the police department, or whether they are the leaders or not. Has there been anything there at all that you've been able to sort of, decipher that is going on that could change, the direction of that police force?
Here, it's also in another very supposedly progressive community where the police tear gas the protesters every night. And now apparently U.S. Marshals are involved in it because it's around the courthouse.
Right.
So all I can tell you, Jeff, is that, just to be honest, when you played that song, it really was very healing for me, because I think Eddie was expressing in that song a lot of how I and other folks have felt lately. I mean, honestly, you can't really go through the kind of experience that I went through without it, affecting you. So what I'm thinking is the music is the healing part of all this, and this is sort of what I'm looking for, and I think other artists in Seattle are looking for, is some kind of healing. I've tried to speak out in the last few days about healing, because I think that's what we're hoping for Dia's love, that's what we're hoping for the families and friends of the victims, and for our community as a whole. So there does need to be healing. There needs to be communication. There needs to be open dialogue. There needs to be... One way to look at this is, instead of sending riot cops, it might be nice to send public relations officers or, negotiators or communicators to talk to people rather than just set up as a opposing police force. But, all of those issues have to be discussed, and it's probably going to happen in the city council. They're the most open to reform in Seattle. They're the most progressive. They survived an onslaught from Amazon money, to make it less progressive. And they are taxing now. They just did vote to tax large corporations in Seattle, which is a big
30 seconds.
issue. There's no... The Historic Seattle has a video about the Showbox Theater that was just released today.
Well, we'll check that out on YouTube. Mark, we got to run, my friend. Thank you for coming on a little bit earlier. Be safe, my friend. You're doing an amazing job as a journalist. Eddie and the rest of Pearl Jam will be very proud. Their fellow Seattleite and fellow musician. We'll be right back. It's the Jeff Santos Show.